Good morning. This is Pastor Allen from the Garrison Church of God, and I also serve the Riverdale Community Church. I'm glad you chose to join me this morning. This is a very special day for me personally. This day is my anniversary. Terry and I were married 40 years ago today, and I'd like to say thank you to her for joining me on this journey. Her support, her strength, her love, and her care are what undergird me, and I am deeply appreciative of that. I am also deeply appreciative to her for our 4 children. They are a blessing in my life. So thank you, Terry. I love you. Thank you for going on this journey with me. I want to take you to Galatians chapter 4, and we're going to be looking at verses 8 and 9 this morning during my message. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the background of this circumstance. In Galatians chapter 4, we get a flavor of why the Apostle Paul went to Galatia in the first place. There are 4 cities mentioned in Acts 13 and 14 involved in this area that was known as Galatia, that is now in the highlands of modern Turkey. These 4 cities are across the mountain range called the Taurus Mountains from Paul's birthplace, which was in Tarsus. The cities are Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. All of these were Roman colonies. A Roman colony was a very special place. It was a settlement that had been designated for the retirement of Roman soldiers. In these colonies, they were given land grants based somewhat on their rank and their years of service, on the condition that they could be called up at any time if needed to pacify problems in the region. And the area where these 4 cities were located, and they stretched in an arc of approximately 65 miles along the mountain range. They were needed for a very specific reason. The Taurus Mountains are very rugged and steep, and a tremendous place for bandits and for insurrectionists and other vagabonds to hide and to sweep down on unsuspecting travelers or to create problems. And so these Roman soldiers, with their military skills, would be quite useful in pacifying and keeping that area pacified for the Roman government. Roman colonies were special also because the people born in the Roman colonies were Roman citizens. Paul himself was a Roman citizen because he was born in the city of Tarsus, which was also a Roman colony on the other side of on the south side of the Taurus Mountains. One of the interesting things about Roman soldiers that many of us don't realize is that they were trained in certain important occupations. Many Roman soldiers were engineers, they were builders, they were stonemasons, they were bakers, they were tent makers. They had many different skills that they brought to the table, and they were intentionally trained by the Roman government for these skill areas. Some of them were trained as doctors or medical physicians. And because of that, they had some of the most up-to-date skills in the area of medicine in the ancient world. In fact, Roman armies, one of the first things they set up when they settled down in an area was a Valerian, which was a hospital. And we would recognize it even today as a hospital. It was staffed, which was intriguing, by men and people that knew what they were doing in the area of medicine. Many of the tools that surgeons still use and many of the medical devices that we would recognize now were developed or began their development under the Romans and their skills with them. One thing that we don't know is that the Romans were skilled eye surgeons. They already dealt with cataracts and other issues, but they also dealt with other problems of the eye through surgery and other medical techniques. If you were Greek, you often went to a spa, which was more like a health spa that was connected with a temple of Asclepius. There you would be put in a room and given sometimes drugs or other things to induce a state of euphoria where you would have a vision and the God would reveal to you the medical procedure. Quite often it agreed with Greek medical texts, but the Romans approached it in a much more scientific way. They collected catalogs of treatments and ways and manners of treating people. That brings me to why Paul went to Galatia. Galatia, because these 4 cities were Roman colonies, likely had hospitals with trained doctors. In fact, Luke probably was from this area himself and was a trained physician. Paul would also meet Timothy, whose father was probably a Roman soldier who had retired in Lystra. So these are the things that we kind of come to understand about what was happening. Paul would say to the Galatians, when I came to you, I was terribly disfigured and I was difficult to be around. And you cared for me so much that you would have ripped out your own eyes and given them to me if that would solve my problem. Paul had come there for medical treatment. Growing up in a Roman colony himself, he understood the quality of Roman treatment for different conditions. This had probably been a congenital problem with Paul, possibly even back to when he was a child. But at this point in the journey, it became serious, and Paul felt that he needed medical attention. This likely was a frustration for Barnabas, his traveling companion, because he had anticipated going up the coastline of Asia Minor and probably entering Greece or the Greek territories. So he is probably struggling a little bit with this whole detour in life. But Paul finds and Barnabas finds a complete and new direction to their ministry in these colonies in the high Anatolian plateau. We do not know what Paul's eye disease was. There are several different possibilities. I will speculate a little bit during my sermon this morning, but Paul describes it as painful and debilitating. In Lystra, Paul and Barnabas had tremendous success. They had come there from Iconium, and in Iconium, they had been in real trouble. The people of the synagogue in Iconium had deeply hated them and wanted to get rid of them and planned to have them stoned. Lystra is about 19 miles from the city of Iconium. In Lystra, there was no synagogue. There was a temple to Zeus just outside the front gates of the city, but there was no synagogue. To have a synagogue in a community, you needed 10 Jewish households, and to be a Jewish household, you had to be headed by a Jewish man. Without those 10 families, you could not have a synagogue. And so Paul goes into this Gentile community of Lystra and is preaching in the streets along with Barnabas, talking in the marketplaces with people. And there he finds a man who has been lame from his youth. And the man has been listening to him. And Paul perceives that he has faith to be healed. So he instructs the man, or actually commands the man, get up, stand up and walk. And the man stands up and walks. It is so astounding to the people of Lystra that they begin promoting the idea that Paul and Barnabas are actually gods come down to the city of Lystra. They believe that Barnabas is Zeus, and they believe that Paul is Hermes. Their Roman names would have been Jupiter and Mercury. The reason for this strange incident is a story by a man by the name of Ovid, who was a Roman poet. About 40 years before this, he had written a story, or a series of stories, called The Metamorphoses. In the Metamorphoses, he had told a popular tale about Jupiter and Mercury visiting this very area around Lystra as human beings, and coming to a city where they were not accepted, but two poor elderly people from the community took them into their house and gave them the best of what they had. And when they realized who they were blessed by Zeus and by Hermes for their kindness and their love. So the people of Lystra, probably playing off of that story, came to believe that Paul and Barnabas were gods come down to earth, and that they could receive a blessing, and the best way to do that was to offer sacrifices in their honor in a huge parade through the town. When Paul and Barnabas found out about this, they stopped the procession and, with every bit of persuasion they had, convinced the people of the city that they were not gods, they were not deities, they were human beings, and that they did not want sacrifice or worship to them. But they wanted the people to understand that it was God whom they needed to trust, and not Paul and Barnabas. Things went on very well for at least a week, maybe a little bit more, until some of the people in Iconium heard about what was happening in Lystra. And some of the Jewish leaders and some of the other leaders who had participated with him in throwing Barnabas and Paul out of Iconium came down and convinced the leadership that Paul and Barnabas were insurrectionists, people trying to create trouble, and they convinced them that they needed to stone Paul and Barnabas. They only seemed to have gotten a hold of Paul, and they took and stoned him to the point that they thought he was dead. He evidently passed out, according to the text. They dragged his body outside the city, believing that he was dead, and left him there. The believers in Lystra surrounded Paul and began to pray for him. And it says that he awakened and stood up and walked back into the city. If I were him, I'd have left. I'd have gone. But freedom means facing up to our fears and our problems and our struggles. As Christians, we don't get to run away from difficulties. We face up to them. Paul had learned this in Damascus. Christ had called him on the road to Damascus, but in Damascus, as he sat struggling with his blindness and with the frustration of the experience, realizing that he had done great evil in his life because of his driven personality, a man by the name of Ananias comes to meet him. He's a Christian leader in the city of Damascus. And to Paul's surprise, this man is not controlled by fear, but he is controlled by faith, and that faith makes him free. Probably free in a way that Paul himself did not understand. Paul would later say, I have counted everything I had previous to this, all my privilege, because Paul was privileged growing up. He came from a wealthy, powerful family. He said, I gave all that up for the freedom of Christ, for being part of his kingdom and being able to follow him. Freedom means living in the moment, even when the moment is unpleasant. If we are fearful, if we are controlled by our fears, we are not free. Paul says, I live free. I am not controlled by my fears. Later on, when he is imprisoned, he would say to great Roman leaders and kings, I wish that you were as I am, only without the chains. I wish you were free because you are not free. No matter how powerful you are not free. Being free means making decisions and living in the grace of Christ. Paul would say to the Galatians, if you go into this area of the law, if you become entrapped in these rituals and believe that they are the foundation of your salvation, you will no longer be free, but you will be enslaved. To be free, you need to be willing to do so without reservation and fear, but with confidence and a belief in Christ's power to change things. Do you believe Christ can change things in your life? Or are you depending on fences and rituals? Christ wants you to come to him and accept his grace and his freedom and live your life in that freedom. God bless you. Hope you join us for service today.